This morning, we have heard two tellings of the Easter story. Deborah read from the Gospel of John for us. I read for you from the Gospel of Luke. Two different accounts of that first Easter, and they're different. They're really different. It's not just the kind of difference that you get from an impression where everybody kind of tells the story from their own perspective. They're different factually about the who and the what and the how. And frankly, the fact that we have different tellings of the Easter story makes it a challenge. In the early church, when they were compiling the books that we call the New Testament, the books that they found edifying for churches to read when we were gathered in worship, in the early church, they gave us not just one Easter story, but four different Easter stories. And those differences really make it difficult for us to kind of wrap our head around it. And that's because many of us in this room were shaped about the way we understand truth by watching a TV show called Dragnet. Everybody born before 1960s laughing, everybody else is like, what's that, right? Yes, Dragnet is a show that had a humorless detective played by Jack Webb. And it seemed like in every single episode, he would be trying to get an account of the crime that had happened from a distraught woman. And she'd start going off on a tangent, and he'd say, "Just the facts, ma'am." And we've thought, why can't they just give us the facts? Why do we have all this emotive stuff in these stories? But for those of you who weren't shaped by Dragnet, we've been shaped by CSI. One of the most brilliant television shows in the history of television. And the reason is they make lab work look exciting, fun, and kind of sexy. All it takes is a little bit of music and some interesting television angles from prisms that I never quite understood, and suddenly it looks like there may be something really joyous about this work, where lab workers would tell you it's nothing of the sort, it takes forever and it's boring. But these folks, they make it look exciting, and they have shaped us to where we think if it's true, it can be verified in a test tube. It can be examined under a microscope. It can be tested and retested, and the results will be the same, and that alone is truth. And so when we look at these gospel stories, four different stories that kind of get all the facts of the matter all messed up, and different people are there, here, and there, and a lot of emotions, and they don't just stick to the facts and get the facts straight, we have a hard time wrapping our head around that and saying this is truth, a truth that we would even stake our life on. Now, for those of us who have a little trouble, sticklers for the truth that we are, amateur forensic scientists that we all think we are, for those of us who have trouble with the truth of the Scriptures, I do want to say this, that it's a relatively new thing in human history to reduce truth to facts. In fact, throughout most of human history, and still in many cultures in the world, there's a wisdom that says you can line up all the facts you want and look at them and study them, and you may still miss the depth and the meaning and the truth of something. So today I'm going to invite you to just kind of take that fact-driven mentality that we've been shaped into and bracket it and set it over to the side for a minute. And to join me in walking through these resurrection stories as if we're walking through a garden. As if we're walking through a garden. Because when you walk through a garden, you have to be there holistically, right? There are things to see, and there are things to hear, and there are things to smell, and there are things to feel, both on the outside and on the inside. You'll have a moment here where you look at something and say, ooh, and a moment over here where you say, ah, and a moment over here where you turn a corner and suddenly you're transfixed and your breath is taken away. And every now and then you run across something either so hideous or so beautiful, either way, a little bit of both sometimes, that you can't take your eyes off of it. And that's what it means to walk in the garden and to be there fully and presently. I want you to hear these Easter stories as a garden. And let's savor everything that's there. We'll start in that section of the garden called Luke's Gospel, the part that I read for you. You remember that the story starts saying it was at the very early part of the day. Dawn is breaking. So you know that we can't see very well, right? There's not a lot of light there. And these women have made their way to the tomb, and they've had to navigate their path from where they're staying to the tomb there in the dark. And you know how it is. First thing in the morning, it's kind of cool, kind of crisp. So we've got a little chill going on in the air. The women come up to the tomb. And they're not identified until later in the story. But here's what we know about these women. On Friday, when Jesus had died on the cross, they took his body down, they wrapped him in linen, and then they laid him in a tomb. And these women had followed those people because they wanted to see where this body was being taken. And they saw his body sealed up in a tomb. And then they rushed back to the lodgings where they were staying because they're from out of town. And they began to prepare ointment and spices, unguents, things like that, because it was their intention to make sure that this body that had just been so grievously treated could be prepared and buried properly. But they had to hurry. They had to hurry because it was almost Sabbath, and you're not allowed to work on the Sabbath. You can't do that, preparing the spices and all of that on the Sabbath. You certainly can't touch a dead body on the Sabbath. So they knew they had to hurry, get everything ready, and then on the Sabbath, they just kind of had to sit on their hands, spend that time resting, being restored in worship, and then first thing, Sunday morning, first chance they had, they're making their way to the tomb. That's who we're talking about, are these women. And as they're getting there in that dim light, they see that the stone's been rolled away. And that's just not supposed to be. Apparently somebody's been working on the Sabbath because somebody beat them to it and somebody moved this stone. And then these women did something that was incredibly courageous. If you're a woman and you're sitting in here, just sit up a little higher, would you? Because this is you. This is your story, and you are impressive. Because these women did something very courageous at this moment. Because the only reason that stone would be rolled away would be because somebody's in there robbing this grave. Or we find out later in the Gospels that there was some political dispute over what to do with Jesus' remains. It could be Roman soldiers in there. And these women went in there anyway. And they went in there ready because, you know, if you take a body that's been stabbed and pierced and mercilessly tortured and seal it up in a tomb for about a day and a half, it's not going to smell wonderful when you walk in there. It's going to be very disgusting to every sense that you have. And they steeled themselves. They went to that tomb, come what may, danger, robbers, nauseating smells, whatever they met, they found their way into that tomb. And there was no body. They saw the linens lying there, but instead of a body, they saw two men. Two men sitting there. And there's a delightful little phrase in the Greek New Testament describing these men that you get to translate in various ways. And some of the translations are lovely. One of them says, they were gleaming like lightning. Another one said they had dazzling apparel. Another one, this is my favorite, glittering apparel, like Liberace sitting there in this grave. Shining garments, dazzling clothes. Wouldn't you love to get a piece of that fabric to the people at CSI and see what they can figure out in their little test tube with that stuff? This stuff is fabulous clothing. And these men are there with this glittering appearance. Glittering appearance. And they ask a question which should really reverberate in our heads for weeks to come. Why? Why are you looking for the living among the dead? Why are you looking for the living among the dead? That's a marvelous question. It's marvelous here in a room full of very vivid people. Imagine hearing it there in a tomb. Why are you looking for the living among the dead? He's not here. They said he was raised just like he told you. And these women, these courageous women, found their strength and they ran from that tomb back to the disciples, the men who were there, gathered, and they shared with them, he's been raised just like he said. And they told him the story of the empty tomb and the two men in glittering apparel and the news that they heard. You know, when you're in a real garden, not a manicured garden that's made to look perfect, but a real functioning garden, there's always that section of the garden with the gross stuff in it. You know, the weeds that have been taken up, or that horrible fungus that grows out of my turf every time the rain falls, and you got to shovel it and put it somewhere. There's always that section of the garden, broken sticks. Next year's manure. You know those things? Our garden has that part too. Because when these women go back and tell the men all that they had seen, the narrator tells us that the men looked at them as if they were telling an idle tale. Apparently, men hadn't invented the word hysteria yet, but it looked at them as if they had been telling an idle tale, and they did not believe it. Folks, this is the first announcement of Easter to the disciples, and they did not believe it. So if you're a woman, I want you to sit up a little straighter, and if you're a man, I want you to kind of go, okay, my bad. There was one man in the group. Oddly, it was Simon Peter, who kind of a jerk in a lot of places, but here he hears the women's story, and at least he's intrigued. And Simon Peter gets up and he runs, and he finds it just like they told him. And he goes away amazed. And that's the story we get from Luke's gospel. It's got feelings, it's got heartbreaking moments, it's got, tensions between the genders. It's got all of those things that we understand in life. Deborah read for us a different account from John's gospel. And in this telling of the story, it's not a group of women who go to the tomb, but it's one woman, Mary Magdalene. This woman who's fascinating and whose life has been caught up in novellas ever since the first century. And apparently, according to the Da Vinci Code, she was Jesus' secret wife. Who knew, right? And but this Mary Magdalene is the one that goes to the tomb in John's story. And again, it's early on the first morning of the week, the Sabbath, or the Sunday. And she makes her way to the tomb. And when she gets there, before she even goes to the tomb itself, she sees that the stone's been rolled away. And she runs away. She runs back to where Simon Peter and a disciple who's only identified as the one whom Jesus loved, the beloved disciple. We're not really sure who this is. I have my suspicions, but nobody believes me. But we have this beloved disciple and Simon Peter, and Mary runs to tell them the good news of Easter. And she makes the first proclamation of the Easter message, and she says, Christ is stolen! That's the first thing anyone says on Easter. Christ is stolen. I told the choir earlier, I'm glad I'm not preaching in a Lutheran church, because I'm relatively sure somebody would have said, Christ is stolen indeed. Alleluia. Amen. We're not quite that automatic here, and boy, am I glad. So that's the first proclamation in John's gospel of what's happening there, is Christ is stolen, because Mary is convinced that somebody has stolen the body. And she runs from the tomb to Peter and the beloved disciple, and they run from where they are back to the tomb, because there are a lot of runners here in this part of the garden, and they get to the tomb. And one of them gets there first and looks inside, and the other gets there second and runs inside. And what they find is linens folded neatly. And the hanky that had been put over the face, rolled up in another spot. I'm not sure what the significance that they're not together is, but it must be important. The narrator tells us that twice in the story. The linen's over here, the hanky over here. And they don't know what to make of it. Because as of yet, they didn't understand when Jesus said the Son of Man must die and on the third day be raised. The beloved disciple sees and he believes, but they still don't quite get it. Then there's a part of the story we didn't read, but I'll just take you a little further into this part of the garden. This is when Mary Magdalene goes back to the tomb. And I always read this part of the story just imagining that everything she's doing, she's seeing it all through a veil of tears. Because she goes into the tomb, and suddenly there are two angels in white. It's not two men in dazzling apparel or glittering clothes, but two angels in white. And they ask her this question, "Woman, why? Why are you crying? Why are you crying?" And she said, "They've taken my Lord away, and I don't know where they've taken him." And they say, "He's not here. He's been raised, just like he told you." And Mary's just not there yet, because she goes out of the tomb. And in kind of a funny, ironic moment of the story, she actually comes face to face with Jesus. But she doesn't know who it is. And the narrator tells us she thinks he's the gardener. And he asked her, just like the angels did, "Why are you crying?" And she asked Jesus, "Do you know what they did with the body of Jesus?" And then Jesus calls her by name. I want you to shudder at how beautiful this moment is. Because what a stone rolled away, and what an empty tomb, and what folded linens, and a rolled up hanky, and even two angels in white apparel couldn't do, Jesus does simply by calling her name. He says, "Mary." And suddenly, her life changes. She's gone from looking for the living among the dead to seeing Jesus. And she answers, "Rabboni," but teacher. She recognizes, she knows that it's Jesus. That's a lovely, lovely part of the story, that everything turns for this marvelous woman, Mary Magdalene. We often think it's funny that she looks at Jesus and thinks he's a gardener. But just for a minute, I want you to play with me, and let's imagine that Mary's right. That Jesus is a gardener. That might be a really valuable way for us to imagine Jesus. If we did, it would be commensurate with God, who's made known in the very earliest creation story that we have. It's found in Genesis chapter 2. And it's a story where God digs in the dirt. One professor calls it the God of dirty fingernails. Because this is the God who takes the dirt and works the soil, and out of it brings grass and vegetation and fruit and trees. And this is the God who takes the soil and out of it creates the animal kingdom. And this is a God who even creates Adam and Eve out of this soil, the humans out of the humus of the soil. This is a God who is a gardener in that early creation story. And then if you bounce all the way to the end of the Bible, the book of Revelation, which shows us the end of history. At the end, all the culmination of human life doesn't lead to an empire or to a cathedral or some kind of great palace. It ends in a garden. This is God's native soil. It's a garden where a river runs through it. And the trees along the river, their leaves have healing for the nations. This is God's place. It's not silly for someone to wonder if Jesus is the gardener. Because here's what Jesus does on Easter. Jesus does what gardeners do. Taking all the compost of life, all that is deadly, all that's broken, all that's been cast aside, all of that, and makes it into life-giving compost. I have invited you to walk through this garden today so we can stop and smell the lilies together. But I also want to invite you to take a whiff of this compost. Because on Easter, what we hear is that God has taken all of those things in your life, those failures and those broken dreams and those addictions and those mistakes and those faults, those things that cause us to hang our heads in shame, and those things where we should have known better, and those things where we just didn't get it done, and all those things that hang over us at night and keep us awake. God, the gardener, takes all of the deathly things in our life and makes it compost for new life on Easter. Thanks be to God. Amen.